My name's Suzanne Dennett, and we are in Atlanta, Georgia on February 23rd, 2013 for a Religious Lives interview. And may I get your full name, and if you could spell it, that would be great.
First name is Danny, D-A-N-N-Y. Middle name Summerfield, S-U-M-E-R-F-E-A-L. Last name Sprouse, S-P-R-O-U-S-E.
Great. Well, we're going to be talking about spirituality throughout your life. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is your childhood. So what was your earliest memory concerning spirituality or religion in your childhood? And if you can recall a specific moment or an event, that would be wonderful.
And then you can hear a pin drop. Thinking back that far, it's hard to remember like a particular experience I had. I mean, there's something a little bit older, in adolescence, but in childhood, I guess generally speaking, I grew up in a family where the women got together on Sundays and then the men got together and they sort of like had their thing that they did in their own groups. And then the women in our family were incredibly religious. They were all about church and the Bible and God and all of that kind of stuff. And growing up as a child, I always preferred hanging out with the women because I was more interested in their conversations about cooking and clothes and stuff like that, and less interested in the men's conversations about killing things and hunting and stuff like that. So a lot of my early childhood exposure, especially around spirituality and religion, came through hearing these women talk about it. I guess probably when I was maybe, I might have been around 7 to 9. I remember one of my aunts had converted to, I don't even remember what the religion was, but whatever it was, they didn't see death as a bad thing. And so then when her mother died, which was my grandmother, everybody was like, distraught and sad and everything, because she had died fairly young and she had cancer. And this one aunt of mine was like laughing and celebrating, and she kept trying to tell people, don't be sad. Mom has gone to a better place. She's so much luckier than we are. She's already now with Jesus and God and, all that kind of stuff. And so, as a kid, that was a little confusing for me because I'd heard my grandmother talking about, doing good and
Right.
trying to please God and all that kind of stuff. And that death was a sad thing because you were losing people. And yet here I had this aunt who was saying, no, religion says that you're supposed to celebrate this death because that person has been able to go on. So that was probably the first time that I can remember now thinking about religion in the context of like afterlife and what it means to believe in something that doesn't exist, that kind of thing.
Wow. What was the religion of your family of origin?
They were, my father was a committed atheist, so
Okay.
he was always talking about how there was nothing beyond life and that once you died, that was it. My mother grew up as a Methodist, but once she married my father and then had the kids, we really didn't have a religious background in our immediate family, so my parents were not religious at all. So the religion that I was exposed to was like from my grandmother and these aunts on Sundays when I would, have these little gatherings with them on Sunday family days.
Would they go to church and then you all would gather afterwards?
Yes, it was always the Sunday dinner kind of thing. So everybody go to church that morning and then come back and have lunch and talk about the service and what it meant and what they got out of it.
Did you ever feel like you were missing out on something?
Yeah, at times I did because we didn't go to the church. So, I got to hear what was going on, after the fact. So sometimes it was a little, I wish I'd been there for that. Now, the one thing we did do, as far back as I can remember, is we went to Bible school.
Oh,
so
okay.
in the summer, our parents always sent us to Bible school, but it wasn't for the religion. It was for them to get a break for a week so they didn't have to deal with the kids. And I do remember thinking how hokey that experience was for me. For example, I remember in one of the little breakout things that we were doing, the teacher, whatever she was, always required us every day to come in having memorized at least one Bible verse.
Right.
And so we would all come in with like, who could come up with the easiest or whatever. So, mine was always Jesus wept, because it was like, that's a full verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. So she wasn't happy about that and felt like that, the kids weren't taking it seriously, which we weren't. I mean, we were, 8, 9, 10 years old, and it wasn't a serious thing for us at that point.
Oh, that's funny. Can you give us a little bit of background as far as when and where this was?
This was in a very rural area in the Shenandoah Valley area of Virginia.
Oh, okay, so real pretty area.
It was pretty. I came from a place called Sprouse Hollow. So it was, very small. All the people that lived in there were Sprouses. On the other side of the ridge were the Campbells, and it was kind of the Hatfield-McCoy.
I was going to ask. Yeah.
Only it was the Sprouses and the Campbells.
Right.
Then they started intermarrying, and so by the time I came along as a kid, there were no warfares going on, but it was a very, very insular community, very closed.
Right.
Strangers were not welcome. It was all family and people that you had married and brought into the family, that kind of thing.
Oh, interesting.
Very private.
Were you baptized?
I was, but not until I was much older.
Okay. And were there any other religious practices in your family? Did you say prayers, anything for the holidays, anything like that?
No, I mean, there was never prayer, like there wasn't grace or anything like that in our family. Until I was like older, and then Mom sort of introduced some of that, and we would say like a really quick little, God is good, God is great kind of thing, and then we'd eat. And then we did like traditional holiday stuff, like we would have a tree and decorations and stuff like that, but nothing specific around religion or spirituality.
Okay. Did your father ever tell you, like, was your father's family atheist as well?
No, those were the ones that were hyper-religious.
Okay.
Everything for them was religion. Every breath that they took had something to do with religion and spirituality and God and all of that. And it wasn't like a lot of what I would call today like in-your-face kinds of Christians, where they're like trying to push their religion down your throat. These folks just simply tried to live their life as they felt God would want them to do it, and that just sort of was like their being. That's who they were.
Okay.
I know that my father, that family background, especially my father's father, was a very violent man. And so I think that my father sort of saw it as a hypocrisy that, out of one side of your mouth, you're talking about Jesus and God while you're beating your kids up on the other side. And so I think it just left him with a really bad taste. And so he just moved into this mindset that there really can't be anything out there, because if there was a God, this wouldn't be happening to me.
Did he do any exploration of any other religions?
No.
So he pretty much just went from...
It was just nothing.
Yeah. Is he still alive?
He is still alive, and he is no longer an atheist.
Oh, okay. We can get into that. Okay. Were there any people of other religions that you were exposed to? Now, this would be as a child.
No. I mean, my other grandmother, she would go to church occasionally, but it was still a Christian church. It was like Presbyterian or something like that. It was just a different denomination, the same kind of stuff. I do remember hearing people in our family circle talking about the Catholics as if they were something else out there. And I really didn't understand Catholicism or that I thought it was all the same thing. It was just different ways of, seeing God. But it was clear when you would hear family talk about it that the Catholics were something different than Christians.
Okay, got it. And were there any influential people? You did mention your aunt. Were there any other figures, either that could be imaginary, something in a book, or real person, that were influential to you or your spirituality when you were a child?
Not before adolescence, really.
Okay.
I mean, that, like I said, that experience with family was pretty much it. That was about all that I had exposure to. Because as I said, we were very insular. When I was like in elementary school, religion wasn't in the schools.
Okay, not at all.
Not at all. So it was, you weren't expected to pray in school or anything like that. It was a very country environment, and you went to learn, and that was it. Religion wasn't a part of your school day.
Okay. Did you ever have any experiences as a child which you would consider spiritual experiences or religious experiences?
Not really. I mean, I had, the imaginary playmates that, as a child you think you can see, and then as you grow up you realize that they're just your imaginary playmates. So as a child I probably considered that to be a spiritual kind of thing, but today looking back on it I would say no.
Yeah. Okay, well let's move a little bit into one last question. How would you have identified yourself religiously when you were a child if someone had to have asked you what religion were you?
Well, the irony is I probably would have said atheist, simply
Would you?
because that's the word that I heard most in our family.
Okay.
So like if my mother would say something like, well, maybe we should take the boys to church on Sunday, my father would go, I'm an atheist, I'm not going anywhere. And so I would hear that word a lot. And you know how kids are, I mean, they pick up on the language that they hear.
Right.
And so I wouldn't be surprised if somebody had asked me that, I would have said, I'm an atheist.
Okay.
Because we used to go to what they called the dump, which is like, it was basically a place where people would throw away all their stuff. But they would set aside sort of the nicer stuff, because then some families that were very poor, like ours, would come up to the dump and go through stuff. And if there was something that was usable, we would take it.
Right.
And so that was sort of my mindset of where everything came from in our home. And so when I was around 8 or 9, my mom and I were getting on an elevator, and this woman came up and she says, "Oh, what a lovely boy you have. Where did you get those beautiful blue eyes?" And I said, "At the dump." Because that's what I heard, that we were going to the dump to get our stuff. And so I assumed everything must come from the dump.
Wow.
So because hearing atheist all the time, I didn't understand that was not
Right.
religion. I just saw that as one other, you could be atheist, Catholic, Methodist, and it was all kind of the same thing. So I would have said, yeah, we're atheists.
So this wasn't, it sounds like it wasn't like a real holy roller type situation.
No, not at all.
That maybe, were there any hollers or towns near you where it was more of that situation that you remember?
Well, there were some churches and some families that practiced that. There were the Pentecostals that, spoke in tongues and fell out on the floor and all that. But I was never exposed to that as a kid. No.
Okay. Well, let's segue into your adolescence then. So how, anything happening spiritually, religiously, kind of as you went from childhood into your adolescence?
Well, yeah, that's where religion started getting interesting for me.
Okay.
I had a couple of things happen. So probably when I grew up in a very difficult family. My father was incredibly abusive. My mom was very weak with him, and so she was basically ruled by him as well. And so I was always looking for a way out. And, I was one of those kids that I tried to run away a lot, and I was always caught and brought back and all that kind of stuff. So one of the ways that I was looking to get away was through religion, because I thought that would be a way to escape. And so I started reading the Bible, and I was, an early teen, 13, 14 at the time. And I was questioning whether or not religion really existed. Like, is this real, or is this just some made-up stuff that somebody wrote down in a book, blah, blah, blah. And so it's like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm sitting there reading the Bible, and I happen to be reading Revelations about the trumpet blowing. And just as I'm reading this, I could have sworn that I hear a trumpet blow outside. So I freak out, because in my mind, as this 13, 14-year-old kid, I'm thinking, oh shit, this is real. I mean, there are trumpets out there. Maybe this is happening now. Maybe this is the second coming or whatever. And so I had, as you can imagine, a very restless night waiting for something to happen. Nothing ever did. And so I sort of tried to move into this level of spirituality, religion, where I was trying to read the Bible more. I started going to church. I really wanted this to kind of be my out. I also knew that my father absolutely abhorred the fact that I was embracing religion, because being an atheist, he didn't like that. So anything that I could do to antagonize him, I would do, because he was always doing what he could to antagonize me. So I really followed, Christianity, going to church. I would do Wednesday night Bible studies, and I was constantly reading the Bible, journaling about religion and spirituality and stuff like that. And once I hit around 14, 15, late 14, early 15, and realized that religion hadn't saved me, and it wasn't really working for me. It was like I was going through the motions, but I didn't feel it. And I came across a Wiccan book. And I read it and I thought, this is it. This is what I've been looking for. So as a 15-year-old, I gather up candles, I get some graveyard dirt, I go up to our local cemetery, I set up this little thing on the tombstone, I'm going through all this little, ritual kind of stuff. Again, thinking that this is going to sort of bring me enlightenment and get me away from my father. And there's a fence next to where the cemetery is. Well, on the other side, there are cows, and there was a bull. And so as I'm doing this ceremony, this bull lets out this bellow, which, of course, as you can imagine, again, is kind of like the trumpets. I'm thinking, okay, so here comes Satan now. He's going to get me.
Wow.
But then as it turned out, I did a lot more exploration with the Wicca stuff. I started reading some of Buckland's material.
Right.
And all of a sudden I thought, you know what I really am connecting to is nature. That there's sort of this, loving thing out there. You don't have to believe in this God that's going to punish you if you do bad, and what really is bad. And, I found this other religion that says there is no sin. It's just be a moral person, treat other people kindly. And I'm like, well, that sounds pretty good to me.
Right.
So that was sort of my segue into what was to become a pagan path.
Now, you said you were baptized as a...
Yeah, so my parents discovered that I was, as they would conceptualize it, dabbling in Satan worship, which it was not at all for me, because I didn't even believe in Satan at that point. For me, it was much more of a universal nature kind of thing. But they were concerned about my soul, and so they were adamant that I consider getting baptized. And this one particular uncle that I was really close to, he had been like very much like my father, and then had found religion, and so he really wanted me to do this, and I really respected him. So I'm like, okay, fine, I'll do it. So when I was 16, because at the time we were going to the Church of the Brethren, which are a part of the Dunkers out of Germany. And that's really, if you ask my family, like, what is your church? It would be the Church of the Brethren. And one of the things that they believe is that you need to come to baptism of your own choice. So they don't do it like as an infant or whatever, because you're not choosing to do that. They feel like that until you can make that choice, God's protecting you because you're too much of a child to know that you need baptizing and all that.
Okay.
But then somewhere in your teens, you're supposed to say, okay, I recognize now I need to be baptized. And for us, it's dunking. So you would get into this either in the river, or if you did it inside in this giant tank of water, you get down on your knees, and then the minister would like dunk you back 3 times for the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost thing.
Oh, 3 times.
3 times. So I did that, and came out, didn't feel any different. I was sort of expecting something to pop or something. And I just was like in a suit and very wet. And
where was it, in the river, or was it in the tank?
It was in the tank because it was in the winter. So
okay. Was the tank heated?
It was just room temperature water.
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't bad. And it was, it was all this pomp and circumstance because there were like these big drapes that are in front of the tank.
Right.
So it's all like closed. And so you go behind there with the minister, and you and the minister get in the tank, and you kneel down, and he talks to you about what's going to happen and how this is saving your soul, blah, blah, blah. And then when it's time, then these big drapes open up. And then the tank is like this glass tank. So everybody sitting out in the congregation gets to watch as you're dunked 3 times and come out washed clean, as they call it.
Did you hear anything?
I didn't hear anything. I didn't feel anything. It was actually a very disappointing experience.
Okay. And did you keep going to church after that?
I did a few more times, and then that sort of faded. And then a year later, I left home. So.
Okay. So that was, you left home when you were how old?
17.
17, okay. Were there any people during, your adolescence and when you left home, were there any influential people to your spirituality at that point in your life?
Not that I encountered face to face, because probably for the bulk of that, it really was around this whole idea of pagan spirituality, looking at Wicca, looking at witchcraft and stuff like that. And there were no practitioners that I knew of in my neck of the woods that were going to, be supportive of that. So it was very secretive, very private. Even a lot of the books at the time that I could get my hands on would say things like, don't share that you're practicing witchcraft with other people, because even today it's still looked upon as like a bad thing and they could harm you and, blah, blah, blah. So
Where did you get these books?
some of them I did mail order.
Okay.
There was Gavin and Yvonne Frost had their correspondence school. So I found the correspondence information in one of the, might have even been in Buckland's book. So I wrote to them and said I was interested in this, and so I corresponded back and forth with them and did their little witchy correspondence class, which was very educational for me because, again, it was, as a kid, I remember thinking that it was all about being a good person without having some kind of either reward or punishment associated with it. It was just be a good person.
Okay.
And that really appealed to me.
So how would you encapsulate your spiritual views? Like, let's say when you were 17, when you were kind of getting into this.
If somebody asked me then, I would have said I'm a witch.
You would have said you were a witch.
Yes.
Where did you get the first book? Do you remember? Did you find it, or did you?
I'm trying to remember. I think maybe a friend had a book and he said, I've got like this really weird book. You want to look at this? And, he thought it was kind of freaky. And so we looked at it. I might have borrowed it. And then there was like reference information in there and mail order stuff and all that was in the book. And so I used that as sort of my jumping off. Because I really think that Raymond Buckland's Big Blue Book was the very first exposure I had to witchcraft and Wicca.
Yeah. I think for a lot of the Wiccans I've talked to, that's kind of common. Did you have any? Was this more of a intellectual thing, or was this more of a feeling thing? As you have said a few times, I didn't feel anything, with the baptism and such. Did you have any experiences where you felt something, or was this more of a you were able to reconcile it intellectually?
I think it was really both. I think that there was some feeling associated with it, but I didn't know what to do with it, so it just became an intellectual thing.
Okay.
So, like, for example, I could be doing some of my ceremonies. Like, I remember there was this the full moon rite ceremony out of Buckland's book. And so I remember sneaking out of the house on a night of the full moon, and I had my salt and, all the stuff that I was doing to do this ritual. And it felt very powerful. And, there was like this, I'm not even sure really how to describe it. There was just a sense that there was emotion attached to what I was doing.
Okay.
I don't know if it was like I was feeling teary because I was sort of celebrating something outside of myself, or, it wasn't conceptualized at that point as like God or God and Goddess or anything like that at all. It was just about like, being able to see the moon and to feel like that was some kind of a spiritual thing. Because, early on, Christianity was all about faith and believing in something that you couldn't see. And now here I find myself, at 16, 17, practicing a religion that I can see it. Because the moon is a part of the religion, and the sun is a part of the religion, and you're celebrating, the God through the sun and the goddess through the moon, and it also felt more normal is not the right word, but it just felt more realistic, to have a father and a mother instead of just a father,
right?
And that, and at that point, I was also coming into the fact that I was gay, and so, of course, Christianity certainly was not meshing with that. But the pagan stuff was like, it doesn't matter what you are, that the goddess and the god are going to love you, and, that everybody's got a little bit of the masculine and the feminine in them, and you should celebrate all that's about you. Whereas, with the Christian stuff, it was you're a boy, so, you can't cry, you got to get dirty, you can't wear dresses, you can't play with dolls, that whole socialization thing. And I didn't get that with the witchcraft stuff, which was really... It was a liberating feeling. But then, of course, I intellectualized it by saying, but it's just a moon. Because at that point, I wasn't really ready to embrace it any further than what it was.
Okay. So what happened when you graduated high school?
Well, I didn't graduate high school.
Oh, okay, when you left home.
So I left home at 17. I had a huge fight with my father. And we basically both threatened to kill each other. And so I left. And it was the last time I had to run away. because when I left that time, they didn't come to get me. I went and moved in with my grandmother, not the religious grandmother, but my mother's mother.
Okay.
And my mother's mother was very broken. She had had a really rough childhood and a rough married life with her husband, who at that point had died, but he was just really abusive and an alcoholic and all that. So she was kind of wounded herself, and so she saw how wounded I was, and so she was, always willing to take me in and mother me. So at 17, I left, moved in with her. She lived in another school district, so we tried to get me moved to this new school district, but the only way they would let me go to this school was if she took legal custody of me, because I was still underage. So my mother, of course, was not going to give up legal custody to her mother to do this. So I went to the GED thing, and I lied and said I'm like 18 years old.
Okay.
They didn't ask for an ID. I took the GED exam when I was 18, passed it, and got my GED.
Okay.
Right after that, I then entered college for the first time.
Okay. And where did you go to school for the first time?
This was at Blue Ridge Community College in Weir's Cave, Virginia.
Okay. And what were you studying?
I started out with philosophy and then kind of moved into mental health, and then I became a dropout.
A dropout? How many years did you go?
I was there for a year and a half.
Okay. And anything during that time in your life, was there anything happening spiritually? Were you continuing on the Wiccan path?
I did some of that. Again, I was kind of dabbling here and there. I took a couple of world religion classes, and that was probably the first time that I had been exposed to such a broad range of other possibilities. And so I found that fascinating. But that was really it. And then I kind of, during that late teens to early mid-20s, there really wasn't a lot of spirituality going on.
Let me ask you about that world religions class. Do you remember it?
Vaguely.
Was it? did they talk about world religions in a neutral type of way?
It was, but it wasn't. I mean, it was broad in my mind, but it wasn't. Like, for example, they did not include pagan faiths and Wicca and stuff like that in it. They looked at Judaism, Christianity, Muslim, then some of the fringe things like Zoroastrianism, whatever that is. And then there was a little bit about some Eastern stuff, so Zen and Buddhism and stuff like that. They touched on a little bit. But that was about as outside of sort of that Judeo-Christian as they went, was sort of the Buddhist Zen kinds of stuff.
Did any of that speak to you?
I like the Buddhism. That really, that kind of resonated, and I sort of saw some of the pagan stuff in the Buddhist thought. And one of the things that stood out about that, and I've even read it since, is the professor was saying that some people see Buddhism as a religion, and some people just simply see it as a way of life, sort of a philosophy. That's not to be practiced like a religion, and that you could do one of these other religions and just incorporate some of the philosophy of Buddhism. And I like that. I mean, that sort of resonated with me, because it wasn't that you had to follow some rule, that it was just like whatever felt natural or felt good inside.
Were there any people of other religions at that short time during college that you were exposed to?
I met some Jewish folks for the first time, because I was coming out of Sprouse Hollow, where it was just wasps, and that was it. So I met some Jewish folks for the first time, and was shocked when I saw them, because I was expecting that I'd be able to pick them out and go, oh, that's a Jewish person. And they were just like me, white guys and girls, and didn't look really any different. Didn't act any different. I did find the yarmulke interesting for a while, but then after that, you sort of get used to that. And I got exposed to a lot of things that I hadn't been exposed to before, even outside of religion. So, I had never been exposed to black people before, because I lived in an all-white neighborhood, all-white school. Okay. So it was my first exposure to black people, to Hispanic people, people who did practice religion, people who didn't practice religion, just all different walks of life when I started going to college. So.
Wow. It just kind of opened.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was almost overwhelming when I first started.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't used to that level of diversity yet.
So you left school, and then what did you do?
I went to work.
Okay.
Got a full-time job as a medical transcriptionist, and started working. Did that for a little while, and then I decided that I needed to leave that area. I wanted to get out of the rural area, and so I moved to Charlottesville.
Okay.
And I lived actually literally right next door to the University of Virginia campus.
Okay.
And I had thought about going there, but it was like, well, maybe I do, maybe I don't. There was another community college, Piedmont Virginia Community College, was also in Charlottesville at the time. So I lived in Charlottesville for a couple of years, decided to go back to school. This time I was going to do business. So went back and did 2 years of business school. Did not do well in it. It was not my forte. So it was clear that that was not what I was meant to do. So I dropped out again.
Okay. And during this time, were you dabbling in Wicca? Had you met any Wiccans?
Yeah, at that point, I met this one, I guess she was a girl at the time, woman, and she was very, she probably wouldn't have called herself Wiccan, but she was like very, what I would say, organic or earthy, kind of Mother Earth kind of person. I don't think that she was confident enough to really call it Wicca or witchcraft or anything like that.
Right.
But I could just tell, like, by some of the language that she would use or some of the people that she would, talk about, that she was kind of, leaning in that. And I never revealed, my thoughts around Wicca and stuff like that. Because I did hear people say things when I was, even in college, like, it's too bad that we can't still burn witches, and stuff like that would be coming up in conversations. And so I was certainly not going to come out and say, oh well, I've dabbled in that, or
where
witch over here.
Yeah. Wow.
So she and I would talk about spirituality in sort of these generic code terms without really coming out to each other about it.
Now, did you have any daily or weekly or monthly Wiccan practices, any kind of religious, spiritual practices during that time?
The only thing that I really, I tried to look at the solstices and equinox, because for whatever reason, those just resonated with me, and I always wanted to celebrate that regardless of what spirituality it was.
Right.
And then the full moon was always important. So for whatever reason, those I would try to do some little ceremony with, or some kind of celebration of nature and sort of the changing of time and that kind of thing.
So you dropped out again. You're in Charlottesville. You get another job?
Yes, I've got another job actually working at the University of Virginia
Okay.
as a medical transcriptionist. And that's where I meet my first long-term partner.
Okay.
And he is a non-practicing, dyed-in-the-wool Christian. He grew up in a very religious home, and so while he didn't go to church and he wasn't like, in your face about religion, if you asked him, he would say, absolutely, I believe in God, I am a Christian. That was sort of, where he came from. And so it was a long time before I shared with him any of my religious views, because he was one of those folks that if he had found out early on kind of what those views were, he would not have been happy with that. Once he fell in love with me and, we had a relationship for a while, then he didn't mind. It was okay for him at that point.
Okay. And how long were you two together?
We were together for about 3 years, and then he had a heart attack at the age of 39.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did he pass away?
He did. It was
Oh,
a
I'm so
massive
sorry.
heart attack.
Wow. And when he passed away, did his parents come to the funeral?
Yes, and his parents were like very good to me. His mother was just very. A lot of his family had the idea that this is just some friend of his, and his mother said no, he needs to ride in the family car in the front. So
Wow.
I mean, she knew what was going on, and she
Yeah.
was very supportive of that, and she knew that I cared for him.
Yeah.
So yeah, he died, Did the funeral, did the whole, oh God, why is this happening to me? Sort of that. So you're in a crisis, you reach out to God, you're praying, you're clutching for something to come and rescue you, save you, make sense of it, whatever. And nothing happened. And it was at that point that I realized that I would never be a Christian again. That faith had failed me when I needed it most. And that I would never look at it again. And I have not since.
Did you go back to Christianity when you knew him, when you were with him?
No, but I just, it was
kind of in there?
It was that, I was sort of struggling at, trying to make some sense of what was going on.
Right.
Why he was dying at 39, why this happened, why didn't I get a chance to say goodbye? And just looking for comfort, because you always hear this stuff about, that was a thing that I used to hear in my family. Oh, well, if you just turn it over to God, he'll comfort you, he'll get you through anything. God doesn't put anything more on you than you can bear. And it was like probably 2 weeks after he died, I almost committed suicide. And so again, it was this whole religious thing where I was trying to what's going on and, help me through this, and it didn't work. And so I thought, this isn't going to happen for me. Christianity is not going to get me through tough times. I've got to find something else.
Just kind of in hindsight, just as a little aside here, do you feel like it truly worked, Christianity truly worked for those people in your family or for other people that were Christians and that said that they got a lot of comfort out of it and it just didn't work for you? Or do you feel like it didn't really work for them and they were just saying this?
I think for some of those family, I think it really worked. It gave them some level of comfort. Just to put it in context, I came from an environment that was filled with male on female violence. I would say the majority of men in that family abused their wives. If not physically, certainly at least emotionally. And a lot of these women used religion as justification for staying. So they would say yes, my husband beat me up and he shouldn't have done that, but God's got a bigger plan for me. Like my one aunt, and she feels that she was vindicated. Her husband was cheating on her with other women, would beat her up, emotionally abused her. He was an absolutely horrid person to her. And she hung in there. And her thing was, God is not going to fail me. The reason he has me with this man is that I need to save his soul. That was her mission in life. Now, when he got to be an old man and women weren't interested in him anymore and he was really too feeble to beat anybody up, he, like so many others, found God. And in her mind, all of a sudden, her entire life of abuse was worth it because she had saved his soul. She had gotten him to go to church. So if you ask her, do you really believe that it was worth it? Do you really believe that God will get you through anything? She would say absolutely yes.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting. It's really, I really like the way you describe that too. That's a good description. So, so after your partner was gone, obviously the suicide didn't work. I guess.
Thankfully.
Thankfully the suicide didn't work. What happened then, physically and spiritually?
Well, I started developing panic attacks and went into a really, really deep depression. Went on psychotropic medication, started seeing a therapist, was just incredibly depressed, and probably like my mid to late 20s was really, really bleak. Just a really, really dark time for me. Yeah. So I didn't do anything. There was no spirituality, there was no praying, no pagan, no anything. It was just me just getting from day to day without another panic attack. That was sort of, if I could get through a day and only have a panic attack a couple hours that day, that was a good day for me for quite a while. And so I got burned out with going to therapy, and I felt like, I'd sort of gotten to a point where it had helped some and it sort of lightened. But I felt like a big part of the problem was that I still lived in the same city where he and I had lived in Charlottesville. Yeah. And so no matter what I did, he was there. So I'd go to a restaurant and I think, oh, I wish James was here to have dinner with me. Or I go shopping, oh, this is where James dropped that carton of milk. Or, oh, this is where James did that, or where we did that. And it was just, I just couldn't get away from it. So I decided to leave, and so I moved to Richmond. To move away from Charlottesville. I had never lived in Richmond before. I moved there. I lived there for 6 months and absolutely hated it. It was, for me, an atrocious city to live in. And it was very, it was probably the first time I felt that a city could be evil. And I really felt evil in that city. And the interesting thing is, I lived in this apartment for about 6 months. I just felt, and part of it intellectually is like I could look off of my balcony and see the prostitutes working the corner. I could look to my left down the street and see the drug deals happening. So I mean, there was sort of that seedier element there, but there was just something that felt really dark and evil about this city, or at least where my experience of it. And that's no slant on Richmond. I'm sure it's a lovely city, but my experience of it was just not that. So I was there for about 6 months, and my brother called, and he said, "I just want to give you a warning." I'm like, "Okay, what kind of warning?" And he said, "I've decided that I can't go on with my life the way it is." My brother was an alcoholic. He said, "I hate it, it's miserable, and I want something more, so I'm going to make a pact with Satan, and I'm going to let him have my soul so that I can have a better life. But I want you to know that in case there's any fallout, so that you're aware of this." And I said, "Well, are you really sure that you want to do this?" And he was adamant, "Yes, I'm going to do it." He hung up the phone. A few hours later, he called, and he's like all paranoid. "I hear scratching on the wall. Satan is around me," and all this kind of stuff. Well, then I felt like this evil presence was being amplified because I had already sort of, felt like this was an evil place, and then I could feel evil. And again, is it this intellectual thing that, I'm thinking, okay, he's already told me this, and so now I'm feeling this or whatever, because I didn't hear the scratching on the wall. But I did just feel like an uncomfortable presence. That's the best, and not like a ghost kind of presence, but just like an uncomfortable presence. Okay. And so I decided after that phone call that I wasn't staying in Richmond, that it just wasn't healthy for me there. So I left Richmond and I moved to Roanoke, where I met my second long-term partner. And we were together for maybe 5 or 6 years. He was probably pretty close to being atheist, maybe, I'd probably say agnostic, was kind of his religious bent. And so I sort of kicked up practicing a little bit more of my Wicca at that time, and he was fine with that. He didn't really care. He didn't participate, but he didn't mind that I would do my little ceremonies and stuff. Excuse me. And so I started reading more books, trying to expand my knowledge about Wicca and stuff like that. And then I looked into a coven, which was the first time that I had really thought about.
So you'd been a solitary.
I'd been a solitary, all this time. I really had no other connection.
Okay.
But I was a little nervous about the coven because, I'd read these horror stories about that it was just a way to abduct you and, get you into their cult and all this kind of stuff. So there was this one coven that they had 2 levels. They had kind of like the introductory thing where you could come in and it was like for the public to see their circle, and then they had the private part which they wouldn't let the public see. It was closed for their own private ceremonies. So I thought, well, what's the harm in at least doing the public thing? Right. So I went, I did the public thing, met some very nice people there. They didn't say it outright, but in a subtle way they let me know that it really was a heterosexual group, and that they were very traditional. They were from the Gardnerian tradition, and so it was all about the male-female stuff, and that, as a male I would need to be paired with a female for the whole rites and all that kind of stuff, which I'm like, well, I'm not doing that. So I didn't end up doing the full, initiation and all that stuff. I just attended a couple of things, and I saw enough of it to know that I was probably happy as a solitary, because I didn't have any other options at that point. I mean, the coven was a closed group, and you had to be paired up with a female to do it, and that wasn't for me. So I went back to doing my solitary stuff, and I fell into some Scott Cunningham books. on solitary Wicca, and started reading that. So then that became really fascinating, and I got into all the dressing of spirituality, and so then I kind of got lost at that point. And for a period of time, I was really lost in the ritual of the stuff and not so much the spirituality. So for me, it was all about making sure I had the right color candle, the right smelling incense, the exact time of day, the right moon, the exact words that I had to say, the smoke, the music, the circle. I mean, it was all this big production.
Right.
And so somebody standing from the outside looking would have said, wow, he's doing that technically correct, and he's a very empty person. Because it really wasn't about the spirituality at that point. It was just going through the motions of the ritual and making it all pretty and fancy and fun. And it was interesting, but it was not spiritual at that point.
So you really weren't feeling anything?
I wasn't feeling it, no.
Okay.
No, it was a very intellectual pursuit at that point.
Okay. And so from Roanoke, and you were still working as a medical transcriptionist?
Still a medical transcriptionist, different hospital.
Okay. And so what happened after you were in Roanoke for a while? And...
I was in Roanoke for a while. Sam and I split up and got my own place and was living by myself. I had a dog, and my dog would act like he would see things in the room that I couldn't see. And at this point, I was still doing all of my, production, but really not, experiencing anything. So one night I was doing this, I had done the circle, was doing like the whole hoo-ha, and normally my dog always stayed outside the circle. When I started doing it, he just kind of like would go away. Well, this one particular night, he came in, sat right at the edge of the circle. He wouldn't come into the circle, but he sat right at the edge of it. And I was trying to generate this, what they called a cone of power. So I was trying to raise this energy so that I could send out the spell that I was trying to do out into the universe. And again, not believing anything was going to happen, not really feeling it. And then all of a sudden, I felt like I was sort of moving into a trance. It was like almost like a hypnotic kind of state, because I kept saying the same chant over and over, and I was just like, moving back and forth, back and forth. And I noticed that my dog kept looking like he was like looking at something over my head. And I would look up and I didn't see anything, and I kept doing it, kept doing it, kept doing it. Well, finally, when I sort of got up to this fevered pitch and I was ready to like send it up, he barked. And when he did, I felt this energy move out of my body, and there was a pop above my head. Literally, like somebody had snapped a finger. And so that freaked me out, because I'm like, okay, this was in my head, and now it's not in my head anymore. This was a real experience for me. And it was that was kind of a turning point for me to move away from the ritual and to get more connected with what that was about. Like, what that energy was. Because I didn't believe that it was like some entity out there that was there. I felt like it was my own energy that was coming out and being manifest in some way. And so it's like I got so caught up in the candles and the magic of it that I was forgetting that there's something real going on here that I'm missing. Right around that time, I had been offered a job here in Atlanta. And so I accepted the position because they offered me this great deal with moving me down here and paying for the move and all that. So I moved here. And when I moved here, it was a new job, new apartment, all that kind of stuff. So I kind of got lost in that for the first year or so. And then I started moving back into pagan spirituality again. And this time I was really focused more on the witchcraft end of it and less on the Wicca. And so just so you have sort of a sense of the difference for me, because some people say, witch and Wicca are the same. Other people say, no, that they're very different. From my perspective, Wicca has a very prescribed way of believing. It's kind of like Christianity. So with Wicca, for example, there's a god and a goddess. The great rite is very important, those kinds of things. So it's kind of like a structured religion in that sense. Whereas witchcraft can be just the function of whatever magic it is that you're doing. You don't need a god and goddess to help you do this. You don't need a ritual. You don't need to cast a circle. You don't need to have a particular color candle. It's more about your intent and how you choose to manifest energy and manipulate your world.
Right.
And so it can be very non-religious. So Wicca is kind of a spiritual practice, and then you can do these other things with it. Some people will say that you can be a witch and not a Wiccan, but you can't be a Wiccan without being a witch.
Okay.
And so I dropped the not even the spiritual piece, but just the deity. Like, I wasn't believing in the god and goddess stuff anymore. I just felt like now it's in me. That there isn't something out there, that all of us have this thing inside of us, that if we just tap into it and manifest it, that's where our real power is.
Okay.
That's where our real spiritual power comes from.
Okay. I'm just curious, what happened to your brother?
My brother is still a bitter alcoholic, still there. Satan hasn't come calling yet.
Okay.
But he has a very destroyed life. His children hardly have anything to do with him. He has no friends. He's very isolated. He's a very sad person.
Do you think that the whole pact with Satan thing, do you take that literally?
I think he did some kind of whatever he thought was a ritual to do that. Now, do I believe that Satan's going to claim him at some point? No, I don't.
Okay.
Simply because I don't believe in Satan.
Okay.
What I do believe is that he believed it. And I believe that that has colored his life. So that he believes that one day Satan will claim him. And so he has lived his life accordingly.
Wow. That's,
Yeah.
so what happened here in Atlanta? So were you still doing spells then, and did you have any more experiences where it was a more visceral feeling type experience?
Well, we did things like I've taken several parapsychology classes, and so I've had some experiences where actually I went back to Stanton, and there was a house there. What was the name of it? It's supposed to be a haunted house. I can't remember the name of the house now. It was right on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, my aunt and I went there. This was my mother's sister. And all we were told was that the house was haunted, but we weren't told, like, what kind of energy was there, that kind of thing.
Right.
And at this point, my aunt was also very spiritual into the whole... she was much more kind of in the Native American spirituality. She was sort of that perspective. For whatever reason, she felt like one of her spirit guides was a Native American spirit, and so that was kind of her bent. And so she was very supportive of my practice, and so she and I hung out a lot. She lived here in Atlanta at the time. So we went to this place, this house, which I wish I could remember the name of it, and a parapsychologist was there, and she said, I just want you to like walk around in the house, jot down any kind of impressions that you get or whatever, and then we'll come back as a group and talk about, kind of what your experience was. And so, I started moving through the house, and I'm like, well, this is really disappointing for me because I'm not feeling anything, because I'm one of these people that I try too hard, I think. And so then I block out any possibility of experiencing anything. So I'm like walking around, nothing's happening. So I'm in the basement, and I just open this door, and I'm just not paying any attention to anything. And as I step in, I like gasp and step back because I see this figure that's sitting there bleeding against the wall. So I step back, and then I look again, and there's nothing there. So I'm like, okay, so now I'm hallucinating. So I get back to the group, we're talking, blah, blah, blah. And then they get around to me, and they go, did you experience anything? It's like, no, not really. In the basement, I thought I was hallucinating, but, And they're like, well, what did you see? And I said, well, I just saw this figure that was like laying up against the wall there, and, they were bleeding. And they were like, so think about that scene. What else did you see? And, I'm like, well, it's all, and I was just sort of describing, well, it looks like a person. And it's like, well, is it a man or a woman? Well, I think it's a woman, longer hair, okay, what else? And so I'm sort of describing the scene. I'm like, oh, there's like a hatchet or something laying next to him. And the parapsychologist goes, do you know the history of this house? Have you been here before? And I'm like, no. And she was like, well, there was a person killed in the basement with a hatchet. And that's what you may have seen. I'm like, oh, wow. So that was pretty powerful for me. So what that really taught me was to stop trying so hard to experience something and just let the experience happen.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And so that's what I've been trying to do ever since.
Okay. So you ended up going back to school, right?
Yes, I went to, so I met Tim,
Mm-hmm.
who I've been with now for 18 years, which is amazing.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I went back to school shortly after we met. I went to community college here, got my associate's degree in psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Then I went to Georgia State, got my bachelor's in psychology, and then continued on and got my master's in professional counseling.
Okay.
And I graduated, I guess, in 2002
Mm-hmm.
with my master's in counseling, and I started doing some psychotherapy stuff, and that's sort of my background training now is psychotherapy. So.
Okay. Do you use any of your spirituality in your practice?
I did. I don't practice anymore.
Okay.
I closed my private practice down. But when I was doing the private practice, I did, but I probably most often framed it in the context of Buddhism for clients, because I think people are a little bit more comfortable talking about Buddhist things like mindfulness and presence and stuff like that, more so than they are when they're hearing things like witchcraft and Wicca. That can conjure up a lot of negative stuff for people. So I tried to, if I was going to talk about any kind of alternative spirituality for people, it was usually sort of framed in the context of Buddhism.
Okay. Where did you take the parapsychology classes?
There was one that was in Virginia through the Blue Ridge Community College.
Mm-hmm.
Dave McKnight was the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
I just wish I could remember that house. And then I took one in Charlottesville, and then there was a class that was offered here through the, it's not the Phoenix and Dragon, but it's the thing next door to it.
I know.
You know what I'm talking
On
about?
Roswell Road?
Yes, on Roswell Road.
Yeah.
The Phoenix and Dragon is like the metaphysical store there.
Right.
Well, right next to it, there's like a
Learning
spiritual
Annex?
center, and
No.
they do like readings and meditations and stuff like that. And they had a parapsychology retreat.
Okay. Well, describe your spiritual practices today. Any that you have.
I probably don't have a lot of practice anymore in terms of like sort of the ritual stuff that I was talking about. Today, it's really more about the moment. I generally try to rely more on my instinct now, and so if I hear kind of that little voice inside, I try to follow it more. I will do things like sometimes, I may bring out the tarot cards and read those or something like that just because I enjoy that. If it's a full moon or if it's something that I want to celebrate, I still really pay attention to the transition of the seasons, and so I usually do something to celebrate that. Now that I have the garden, usually I try to do something outside in the garden that's celebrating the seasons. If somebody said, so what is your belief, if you could put it in a box and say this is the belief, probably the best I could do right now would be to say I'm a pagan, because it's sort of that encompasses kind of this broad concept of spirituality where it's not Christian or it's not Wicca, it's not something that you've got these defined things. It's more about, for me, nature and the transition of seasons. I don't believe in a God that's like out there in pearly white gates kinds of stuff. For me, it's more about, God's in this table, God's in this plant, God's in the grass outside, God's in the dirt, God's in us. It's like sort of this whole, pervasive experience. So I don't really, there's no church, there's no practice.
So you too don't go to church?
No.
Or go
For a while, actually for quite a while, Tim and I went to the Northwest Unitarian Universalist congregation because they're very welcoming of everyone, including gay people, but then even other spiritualities and stuff. So there were other pagans there. There were Buddhists there. There were Christians, Jews. It was just, a wide range of people. And then the minister that we really liked left, and then the backup came in, and we really didn't connect to that person, so we kind of fell out of that, and then we just never went back.
Yeah. Did you have a commitment ceremony or a marriage?
We did, yes.
And commitment ceremony, because it was in Georgia?
Correct.
Okay. And was there spiritual aspects to that?
Yes, we both wrote our vows, and his best friend and my best friend actually married us. They went through the brief little process to become ordained ministers, because since it wasn't going to be legal for us in Georgia anyway, we didn't really need a pastor per se that was going to be able to make it legitimate. And so they facilitated the ceremony, and there was some spirituality in there about nature and being wrapped in nature, and the sun in our face, the wind at our back, kinds of thinking. I'm trying to think. We did some poetry. There was some poetry stuff. This was 17 years, 18 years ago now, so it's hard to remember what we used.
Wow.
So yeah, there was some spiritual stuff, but it wasn't, there was no Bible, there was no circle cast or anything like that. It was just more about the tone of our experience.
Was your family there?
My aunt, the one spiritual aunt that I was talking about earlier.
So you said that you alluded to earlier that your father is not an atheist anymore?
No. My father was a very committed atheist, and I guess 10 years ago, 13 years ago, my mother passed away at 61. And he was wanting to, make sense of, why she died so young, blah, blah, blah. His very religious family was there to support him, and was basically saying, if you just turn your life over to God and trust Jesus, will help you through this, blah, blah, blah. And so over a period of a year or so, through his grieving, with her loss and all that, he started going to church again. He got baptized, and now he's a holy roller, born again. You got to be saved or you're going to hell kind of mentality. So he's gone 180 to hyper religious now.
Right. And do you have contact with him?
None.
Oh man. And so is your aunt the only one in your family you still really have contact with?
Actually, she's passed away too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the only person that I really have any contact with now is my brother.
Okay.
And that's through Facebook.
Yes. Well, you had talked about a few kind of extraordinary spiritual experiences, and they all kind of, to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, kind of hinged on an awesomeness, but kind of the fear spectrum. Have you had anything along those same lines that's been just downright positive or feeling really good? Or
I did have one, and this was, I guess, maybe about a year and a half ago. There was a full moon, and I thought I'm going to do a full moon ceremony and bring out all the stuff, because I keep everything. So I did the altar, I did the circle, and all that kind of stuff. And while I was sitting there in the circle during the ritual, there's one point where you're talking about, you talk about things to the universe that you feel like are missing, or that you'd like, or that kind of thing. And so in this, I was sitting there thinking, or saying, well, one of the things I'm really missing is that I don't feel connected to anything greater than myself. That it feels like this is as good as it gets. And that I would love to be one of those people that could believe that there was a God out there. I mean, it would be so nice to be like that Christian who says, I absolutely, with 100% conviction, know that there's God and there's Jesus, and I believe this with every fiber of my being, and I celebrate that. I just have no idea what that would be. I don't get that.
right.
So I'm sitting there in this circle, and I am saying, if there really is a God and a goddess out there, why don't I feel you? Why don't I see you? Why don't I experience you? Why do you have to hide? Why can't you just make yourself known and stop with the bullshit and just, manifest yourself so that I know that I'm not alone? And all of a sudden, I had this feeling wash over me, and it felt like somebody was hugging me, and I started to cry. I'm even tearing up now. Because that was really powerful. Now, was that me hugging myself from the inside? Was that spirit outside hugging me? I don't know. I do know that I felt hugged in that moment, and it made me cry. I felt like there was really something there.
Wow.
But it didn't keep me, going back to the circle and practicing. I mean, that was it.
Right.
That was all I did.
Do you feel like your years as a psychotherapist had influenced your spirituality?
They've ruined me.
They ruined you.
They did, and I say that sort of tongue in cheek, but yes, actually, and I know GSU may not want to hear this,
Please.
but actually, going back to college, it really caused me to be much less spiritual. The reason is, before I went to school, I used to believe, like I was describing that Christian thinking. I used to believe, for example, 100% wholeheartedly in reincarnation. I really believed that no matter what your spirituality was, what your religion was, that there is reincarnation. I felt there was enough evidence out there, looking at things like in India and places like that, and people coming back and knowing things that they could not have known otherwise, or certain scars. There just felt like enough stuff for me to, be able to hang my hat on that. So I believed that with every fiber of my being. And then I went back to school, and I did all of my science classes and all of my cognitive classes and my psychology classes and my behavioral classes. And what happened at the end of that was that it washed through me this idea of a scientific thinker. And so then all of a sudden I became this person that needed proof. So it wasn't good enough to just believe it anymore. I now needed to see something tangible, kind of like what I just described with, why don't you show yourself? Give me a sign, do something for me. And so that really took that away. And it really wasn't GSU. It was it's because I actually, my mind shifted to this sort of very concrete scientific way of thinking. And so then I started wanting proof of spirituality, and that's not exactly how spirituality works.
Okay. And did this have anything to do with shutting down your practice?
No, not really. Honestly, one of the main reasons that I shut down my practice was because I felt that the people that I was seeing didn't need me, that I wasn't helping them, because they were... When I did my clinical internship, I did it at Positive Impact, and so I worked with a lot of HIV positive folks, people that were really struggling with their lives. A lot of them were homeless, they were jobless, they were very wounded in so many ways. And then when I had this private practice, I got all of these ultra worried well people, like the woman that would come in and go, I'm just so disappointed because the diamonds in my tennis bracelet are just not as large as I thought my husband should have had them. That kind of, and I just couldn't deal with it anymore. It's like, you just need to get a life. That's your problem. You need to recognize the suffering that's out there in the world.
Yeah.
And so I just got so much of that I couldn't deal with it anymore. Because I found myself sitting there going, I can't help you. Because what I want to say to you is grow up. You've got a wonderful life. You don't have anything going on with you. And of course, as a therapist, you can't really do that.
That's right.
And I just didn't feel that I was going to be there for them.
Right. No. So if someone were to ask you today what your religion is, how would you describe yourself?
I certainly would put the term agnostic in there, because I've not completely written off that there's the possibility that there's something more. So I certainly wouldn't say, that I'm an atheist and I absolutely don't believe, because to me that's kind of like just being the opposite of the Christian that says I absolutely do. Right. It's like there really is no absolute. I'm kind of open to the possibility. But then I'm also open to the possibility that there is nothing out there. It could just be, what it is. I don't know if you're familiar with John Edwards. Probably the most significant thing that still haunts me today, that colors my spirituality, is something that happened in association with watching his show about 11 or 12 years ago. My mother died when she was 61, and it was a massive heart attack. She died within 10 or 15 minutes of having symptoms, and so she was gone before anybody could even get to her. So it was incredibly traumatic for our entire family. And so I was looking for some spirit thing, show yourself, show up, come back to me, Mom, show me that, there's a spirit world out there. Well, none of that happened. And so I was watching one of John Edwards' shows, and in one of the segments that he was doing, there was this woman who had lost, I think maybe her husband, and they had gone to Canada, and these things had happened for them about, like, they had found something that meant something to the person, and it turned out that it was this feather that, and John was saying, well, if that's your husband, he left that for you to find here, and he's left you another feather over here, you're just not seeing the signs, and so, So I'm, in my fit of rage going, okay, Peggy, which is my mother's name, show me a sign. I need to see something. So the next morning, as I'm leaving for work, I open the front door and there's a feather laying on the welcome mat. So Tim goes, look at that. That's a sign. And I'm like, it is coincidence. He's like, okay. So at the time I was taking MARTA, so I get to the MARTA station. I'm standing there waiting on the platform. And as I'm standing there waiting, a bird feather drifts by on the platform. I'm still thinking, this is a coincidence. Go through my day, nothing else happens. Next day, I'm working out in the yard. There's another feather there. And Tim says, this is 3 feathers. And I said, yes, but it's out in the yard. There's birds out here flying everywhere. There's no reason, why that there wouldn't be a feather out here. And so then when we come back inside, as we open the door, there's a feather inside the door that had blown in. So at that point, I'm like, okay, Mom, maybe you're there. So I wasn't willing to give it 100%. But that, of all the experiences I've had, that probably is the one that haunts me the most and probably gives me the most hope that maybe there is something else. The interesting thing for me is that my biggest concern is death. And kind of wondering, like, what is there after death? And even more so for the other people in my life than me. Because it's like, if I die and there's nothing else, then there's nothing else. And I'm not going to know that, and I'm not going to miss it, so it's no big deal. But I would like to think that the people that I love and care about who have died and who will die, that there's something more for them. And especially because I've known so many people that have had miserable lives, like my mother. So, it's like, I hope that there's reincarnation. I hope that there's, like, a better life, a better something that you get than what you had here. So that would be probably my, spiritual push right now, is to just hope that there's something bigger and better out there.
Are you doing any kind of exploration of
I'm always doing it, yes. And actually, interestingly enough, photography is kind of my new way of doing it. What I'm trying to do through my photography is to figure out a way that I can capture something beyond what you see. Like I said to you earlier, I'm trying to capture the spirit of a person, the personality of a person, so that people look beyond, oh, well, they've got blonde hair, or they've got blue eyes, or they've got that nose, or that mouth, but that there's something else that's captured there. Because I think when we go through our day-to-day existence and we see people and encounter people, we see them with what we see. The color clothes they've got on, the style they're wearing, how they've got their hair done, the little bit of spinach they've got between their teeth, like those kinds of things. But we don't really look at the energy of the person, sort of the spirit or the personality, whatever you want to call it, that sort of lives behind that face. So that's what I want to try to capture in my photography.
Have you ever captured anything else in your photography? Anything strange?
No, nothing strange.
No
orbs, no ghosts.
Nothing
Like that. Now, interestingly, one of my best friends, who is at, she works at GSU, Susan Ogletree. I was one of the pagan officiants at her wedding when she and Robert got married.
Oh.
She had asked me to do that, so I did. And as I'm standing there doing the ceremony, somebody was taking pictures, and there's this giant orb that looks like it's hovering over us as I'm doing my part of the ceremony. She thinks it's spirit that was hovering over us. I told her it was probably just a flare from the camera.
Being a photographer.
Yeah.
So I understand these things. Wow.
Yeah, so no, I've not caught anything like that.
Yeah. Well, this has been great. I just, let's see. I think we've gone through everything.
I hope I haven't talked too much.
No.
Because the person that's transcribing this probably hates me right now.
You are perfect. Let's talk a little bit about Georgia State then, because you've already touched upon it, and this is great. We want honesty here. So, okay, what is your strongest memory of either religion or spirituality associated with Georgia State?
Oh wow. Well, it's probably not a good memory.
That's good.
When I was doing my graduate work, there was a student in my cohort that was going through who was a fundamentalist Christian in the counseling program. And every time things would come up around religion or spirituality, like, for example, we were talking about being, say, culturally competent with clients and respecting religion and stuff like that, he was always sort of being the opposite of that, saying, no, you've got to let them know that homosexuality is wrong and that, women need to be subservient to their husbands. And, he came from that really biblical, literalist, fundamentalist perspective. Mm-hmm. And so I remember going through that program, for the first part of the program, thinking, why in the hell is he being allowed to go through this program? Because if he gets through this and becomes a counselor, and then he gets a gay client or a woman that's being abused, you can only imagine what he's going to be telling those people, Right. As it turned out, I think that he probably didn't finish the program because I think there were so many complaints lodged against him. But that really, from a spiritual, religious perspective, probably has stuck with me more than anything. Just seeing how toxic his belief system was to himself and to everybody around him.
Right.
And that he couldn't just believe in his own thing, but that he felt like it was his duty or mission to make sure that everybody else felt as he did or believed as he did.
That's intense. And this was 2000 and... When would this have been? Like 2006?
Let's see. I think I started my graduate program in 2000. I think it was like 2000 to 2002 is when I was in the graduate program.
Okay. Did you and your cohorts talk about religion much?
Some, but not. It wasn't like a big topic of conversation. Mm-hmm. There were some pagan friends that I had. In there were a couple of friends that we would talk about like spirituality and religion in terms of getting together and reading like tarot cards and stuff like that together.
Do you think that Georgia's were people open to identifying themselves as Wiccans?
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
Okay. Was there any kind of Wiccan organization on campus?
Not that I know of, but I know that several of us we were talking about Wicca all the time, and especially when I won't say his name, but when the fundamentalist was talking about his stuff, we would sometimes bring it up. Okay. But it wasn't like anything formal, and I can't remember any classes that we took that were specifically related to spirituality or anything like that.
Okay. Did you feel either particularly misunderstood or understood kind of at Georgia State in terms of your spirituality?
No, I didn't. And actually, to tell you the truth, probably going through the graduate program, my sexuality was a bigger deal than my spirituality at that point. And not in a bad way. I was just blown away by how welcoming like the faculty in the counseling program were around sexual orientation, that I didn't have to hide it or pretend that I was straight or any of that stuff, that I was gay and I was open about it. And for the most part, other than the one guy, my cohort were fine with it, and or if they had problems with it, they never said anything to me. Okay. The faculty there were, very supportive of anybody's sexual orientation, bisexual, gay, whatever. So that I found, more uplifting probably than if they'd had some kind of a spirituality group or something.
Right. Okay. If someone had asked you to describe the religious environment at Georgia State University, what would you say?
Well, I have to say for myself, kind of non-existent.
Okay.
Just because if it was there, I wasn't aware of it and participate in it.
Okay.
So that's not to say that there isn't something there. It's just that I didn't connect to it.
Okay.
I would assume that there's probably different groups that would meet, on
Mm-hmm.
campus to talk about spirituality and religion and stuff like that. Like I said, there were like 3 folks in particular, and the 3 of us, myself and these other 2 women, would get together and talk about pagan spirituality and energy healing and stuff like that. His name just went right out of my head. Roy Kern. He had a student that did some energy work as a part of psychotherapy.
Okay.
And Kern was one of my professors. He was my supervisor for my clinical internship. And so, he was very open to talking about energy and how energy can affect mood and, putting positive spins on the DSM, and don't look at it as like some kind of a disease, but look at it more as like, a coping strategy is failing, and some of that could be spiritual failing and stuff like that. So that was, that was good.
Yeah.
That was helpful.
Okay. And what did you get your? What did you do your thesis in, or did you have to do a thesis, or?
We didn't. We had to do a internship.
Okay. No big paper.
No big paper.
And so maybe just touch back on this just one second. Your experience at Georgia State. You said that it did influence your spiritual life.
It did, in that. If the goal was to train a mind to become more scientific and analytical, it did that.
Okay.
But the trade-off for that was that it caused me to look at spirituality in the same light as if I was looking at evaluating behavior of a client, or making a decision about setting a goal and then achieving it, whether it was taking a class or doing some kind of a research project. If I was measuring statistical kinds of stuff and generating reports, running SPSS or whatever, it was all about like looking at what is the most effective way to do this, to make sure that there's no errors.
Right.
And you just don't get that in spirituality. That you can't get the proof that I expect, because you can't prove that there is a God out there.
Right. So do you see them? Do you see it at any way or any time them becoming more mutually compatible, like the whole scientific way of looking at things and spiritual way of looking at things?
I think that can happen. I've got other friends who, like Susan is one of them, for example. She's very much that way. She works in behavioral research and educational research, rather, and she's very scientific minded, and yet she still holds on to that spirituality piece. And part of it for her is, I think that she looks at small things and sees them as validating her spirituality. And so, like, if something happens, if she's kind of like meditating on something or thinking about something, and this lone leaf falls into a pond and she sees it sort of drift away, for her that has meaning. Like, there's a reason that I'm seeing this now. Maybe it's because I'm feeling so isolated, and that poor little leaf is now isolated in this big sea. And so then she'll sort of reflect on that. And in my mind, it's like, but why did that leaf fall there? Is it saying that there's this isolation, or is it saying that really what's isolated are the little molecules inside the water that are creating this big thing, and that the leaf is now covering many of those up? It's like, I want to know the answer, and
Right.
There is no the answer.
So, okay, great. Well, are there any other questions that I've left out that you think would be important for me to understand your spirituality, or anything
I
else
hope
you
not.
want to say?
I can't imagine anything I didn't say.
Okay, great. Okay, so we just need to get a little bit of demographic information.
Okay.
What is your occupation?
I'm the director of the Mister Center at Positive Impact.
Okay. Of the what center?
The Mister Center.
Mister Center.
MISTER, all caps.
Okay. And when and where were you born?
I was born in 1963 in Stanton, Virginia.
Okay. And how do you describe your ethnicity?
White.
And your educational background?
I have a master's degree.
Okay. In counseling?
In counseling.
And your marital partnership status?
I have a partner.
Okay. And for 18 years.
For 18 years.
And do you have any children?
No, not unless you count these 3 cats sitting here.
Beautiful. And what is your current GSU affiliation?
Well, I mean, I have some friends that work there,
Okay. And
but I'm not affiliated with the university.
alumni.
An alumni, yes.
And your current spiritual affiliation?
I'd say that I'm probably agnostic, pagan. Yeah,
Okay, great.
I'm an agnostic pagan.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This has been great. This has been
Good.
really wonderful. You did wonderful.